Yes, that is right. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome all in to the final edition of the SNL's greatest cast members of all time countdown. We have finally made it here to the top 3 cast members of all time. On September 6th, we put out a poll on all social platforms to ask you who you think the greatest cast members in SNL history are. We counted out the top 50, and week by week, we have been revealing the results. And we are finally here on the shortest day of the year, right before Christmas, to get into the results. I'm so excited to do this, to talk through this with our 2 guests tonight and everyone else in the chat. So let's get to it. Bringing in Andrew Haskell. Haskell, how are you?
Oh my God, the top 3. And no, I'm not talking about our countdown. I'm talking about the top 3 SNL podcasters in the world together. Here we are. And we just so happen to be talking about the top 3, the bronze, the silver, and the gold. Here we go. This is so exciting. For everybody who's been following along with this list, like I'm sure we have a lot of people on the internet who feel like they know where this is going, but I'm so excited to find out.
Yeah, I was very excited to reveal this. It's been week after week that people have been guessing about who will make the top 3. I'm sure a lot of you know, but we will reveal the order tonight. And the great part of it tonight is that our panelists also do not know the order yet of the final 3. So we couldn't do this final episode without Bill Kenny. Bill, how are you?
John, I am so great. I'm so excited. I was here with you at the beginning of this. Remember the writer's strike? Remember not knowing when season 49 was going to happen? Like,
Yeah.
that's crazy. That's like 50 Kevin Nealons ago. Very excited. When you announced that Haskell was going to be on this panel too, it was like finding out Kate was going to host a Christmas episode. I'm so happy to be with my brother from another mother and you, and can't wait to talk this through.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll get into it. So, Bill was with me right from the beginning of this thing, and this was going to be our only gig in the fall until we found out that the season was coming back. And it was really fun to get to do this week after week, going through the legacy of each and every one of these cast members. So, we will kick off the show the way that we have every single week here at the podcast by talking about the list so far. So, who has made the list from 50 all the way to 4 last week? I'll bring the results up on screen. So if you're just checking in now, you have plenty of content to go back to if you don't want to be spoiled. But here we go. 50 all the way to 4. From the bottom, Kevin Nealon, Joe Piscopo, David Spade, Mikey Day, Tracy Morgan, Chevy Chase, Jimmy Fallon, Bowen Yang, Martin Short, and Sherry O'Terry. 40 up, we got Ego Wodum, Taron Killam, Chris Parnell, John Lovitz, Beck Bennett, Jane Curtin, Seth Meyers, Daryl Hammond, Anna Gasteyer, and Bobby Moynihan. 30 up, we got Tim Meadows, Vanessa Bayer, Bill Murray, Rachel Dratch, Adam Sandler, Jan Hooks, A.D. Bryant, John Belushi, Molly Shannon, and Andy Samberg. Our top 20 consists of Norm Macdonald, Mike Myers, Will Forte, Dan Aykroyd, Jason Sudeikis, Fred Armisen, Maya Rudolph, Chris Farley, Tina Fey, and Gilda Radner. Our top 10, ladies and gentlemen, is Kenan Thompson, Dana Carvey, Cecily Strong, Amy Poehler, Kate McKinnon, Kristen Wiig, and Eddie Murphy at 4, revealed last week. Haskell, how do you feel like the listeners have done so far before we get into our final 3?
Yeah, the one that's always stuck out to me is Chris Farley at 13. I don't know who I would switch him out with. I'm just very surprised. He's a beloved cast member. I was really shocked to see that Chris Farley didn't end up in the top 10. Just based on, how people feel about him. Maybe a little bit of sway because he's no longer with us. So not ending up in the top 10 was surprising to me. But really, that 10 through 4 is so strong, and it's hard to argue against any of them. Kenan definitely deserves to be in that top 10. You have that, like, right in the middle there, you have those really strong female cast members. I grew up with Kristen Wiig and Amy Poehler, and then a little bit later, Kate McKinnon, Cecily Strong, and yeah, they all deserve to be in the top 10. I think the listeners have done a great job kind of balancing out history and not forgetting some cast members that might not even been around when a lot of our listeners were alive, but still respecting what they did for the show and still giving props to some people who we don't necessarily know what their legacy is yet because they've only left the show very recently or they're still on the show. So the listeners did such a great job. And let's see if they can round it out with a really good top 3.
Bill, How do you feel about the list and how it's come together so far?
Uh, Much of what Haskell said here. I'm very proud of our listeners and showing how much they are true fans. Obviously, there's going to be discrepancies with everybody's feelings, everybody thinking, trying not to put your favoritism over what you think. I told you earlier in the week that having Dana Carvey out of my personal top 10 was really tough. But like, yeah, I think mostly overall, I think some of the original cast got a little bit lower than they should, but that's going to happen when it's 45 years ago. Maybe not everybody has gone back and watched everything from that era as we all have. But yeah, overall, fantastic list. Great job by everyone.
Okay, so the show will go like this. We will talk through the final 3 people on this list. Then we'll bring up the whole list. We'll bring up my list, which I have finalized and etched into stone about who my top 50 are. Every week I've been having fun putting them in together. I've moved some people up, some people down. I'll go through that at the end of the show. We'll also talk about some honorable mentions who almost made the list. We're going to tell you the other 10 or so names that almost made it to the list. And if any of them, we would switch out onto our own lists. Okay, so Haskell and Bill, like I mentioned, you don't know who the top 3 cast members are. So we're going to reveal them one at a time. Just for fun, let me ask you both. Do you want to predict the order tonight? It may not be the order you want it to be, but let me know what you think the order will be tonight. Bill, do you want to go first on this?
Yeah, sure. I think we're going to have Hader at 3, Hartman at 2, and Farrell at 1. That would be my prediction.
Haskell, who do you think the order? How do you think the order will go tonight?
I think it's going to go Bill Hader at 3. And then I think because of the influence of this podcast and always going back and giving props to Phil Hartman, I think we may have swayed some of our younger viewers that may not have known, and that skewed things a little bit. So I'm actually going to go with Will Ferrell at 2, and then Phil Hartman's going to come out at number 1.
All right, those are the predictions in the chat. You can put your predictions as well for another few seconds before we bring up our number 3 cast member. Okay, let's do it, everybody. Cue the music. We're going to talk about the number 3, the bronze number 3 cast member in SNL history. So this is somebody who I have been so excited to talk about since the start of this podcast. A personal favorite of mine here at number 3 is the one, the only, the legendary Phil Hartman comes in here at number 3, the glue of Saturday Night Live. 8 seasons at the show, 1986 to 1994, 153 episodes, 19th all time, 1,018 sketches, second of all. You can't even say it. I'm so excited about that number. 1,018 sketches, second all time, had the sketch record for a very long time. I think from, those teen seasons when he was on all the way through to the early 40s of SNL, he held the record for the most sketches in SNL history. Kenan Thompson has since surpassed him. But, the amount of sketches he did in the amount of time you'll get to see here with the SPE we have on screen, which is 6.4, first in SNL history. I'll get into some of these deep analytics as we go. But to me, the glue, I believe probably the greatest SNL cast member in SNL history. So many moments to talk about, so many great things. I got to get the panel's reaction here. Bill, I know this is your generation, your favorite, cast ever. How do you feel about Phil ending up here at number 3?
Can't say I'm not a little disappointed to see him not get the number 1 spot. I thought he'd be in, like I said, in number 2 because of Will being more recent, but still very deserved. Again, it's been 25 years since he's been on the show. Such a fantastic cast member. Everybody to a man and woman says how great he was, how well he worked with everybody. All of his impressions, like he started the Clinton impression. He did the first Trump, for better or worse, Ed McMahon, Sinatra. And then, of course, Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer, Johnny O'Connor in those fantastic sketches with Lovitz. He's just so great. Very well deserved. And again, after so much time, for him to be this high is high praise.
Haskell, what do you think about Phil Hartman at number 3 on the list?
I'm a little surprised. Now, personally, for me, when I looked at the three that we were kind of thinking about, for me, Phil Hartman's number three. I thought that kind of his reputation and his legacy in the show was actually going to lift him up to number one. Three is where I would put him. I do wonder, unfortunately, if he falls to three because of tragically dying, young, because he doesn't have the recognition of a movie career that went through the 2000s and the 2010s. I really think maybe if that happened, he's number one. But he is an all-time number three is well deserved. Like you said, he was, when you watched SNL at that time, it was Phil Hartman. He was going to be in sketches. But the thing about Phil Hartman, when they say he was the glue guy, I think maybe sometimes that gets thrown around in the wrong way. The glue guy meant that he worked with everybody. He wasn't just the guy. He worked with everybody. And if you go back and you watch a lot of Phil Hartman sketches, he wasn't just like a screen hog. He wasn't a guy that was taking up all the lines. He wasn't a guy that was taking up all the screen time. He plays minor roles in a lot of those sketches, and he allows other people to shine. He obviously had his ridiculous moments and where he shined, but he also played the straight man a lot. He also played the dad a lot, and he allowed other people to build off of that, So I'm very, very surprised to see him fall to number three. But of course, he is a top three all-time cast member, and I think that alone is an accomplishment.
Absolutely. Look, Phil Hartman to me is everything I ever would look for in an SNL cast member. He checks all the boxes for me in every way. Is he built in a lab to be on Saturday Night Live? The guy is perfect. He is exactly what you would want. You would build Phil Hartman in a factory to be on SNL. I can't explain it even more. It's just, he is so good in so many different roles. His range is unbelievable, but he never needed to be the star of any sketches, even if he was so understated in the fact that, I think he is the shining example in SNL history of a cast member who made every single person around them better. That is so hard to see with the naked eye. But if you really go back and you watch all those things, I think everyone around him, Dana Carvey, Kevin Nealon, John Lovitz, Jan Hooks, everyone he loved to work with, I think got better and raised their game because Phil Hartman was as good as it gets. And he came out swinging from the moment that he joined the show. He was fully formed he never went down. There was no yes, analytically, he may have peaked at a certain point, but as far as just watching him go throughout his career, there was never oh, we never got tired of Phil because he always hit whenever he was on the show. So, is he the best cast member of all time? Definitely. Best is something I would consider with him. As far as analytics are concerned, guys, 6.4 sketches per episode. Only Charlie Rocket has a greater analytic there, but was only on for 11 or 12 episodes of the show. So you don't count that in this case. But for somebody who was on for 153 episodes to be in 6.5 sketches in an episode, that's unbelievable. It's a crazy number. It's a Babe Ruth number, in my opinion, to be able to do that. That's the comparison here. He was the number one sketch leader from season 12 all the way through season 19. That is just, it will never be done. That's it's like a sports team winning 8 championships in a row. He's the Chicago Bulls of his era. It's unbelievable what he did. The New York Yankees, that is him. He was in 137 sketches in season 16, 145 sketches in season 17, and 143 in season 18. That 145 sketch mark in season 17 will never be broken, ever. Nobody will ever touch that mark. So from an analytics perspective, he breaks the mold beyond anybody else. And as far as legacy is concerned, that is why he is at 3, unfortunately, in my opinion. It's just because he hosted twice. He hasn't been around for a long time. Doesn't get brought up on the show as much as he should. But for us, for fans who have really watched the whole show, to me, he deserves every accolade he could possibly get. So in my opinion, he does deserve to be in the number one spot. Bill, what do you think?
Yeah, without a doubt, he should be number one. Like I said, I had a feeling he wouldn't be. I thought he'd at least get number 2, but fantastic. And the stats you just quoted are so amazing. We talk about Keenan being the glue of the show today, but he's only been the sketch leader how many times? 2 or 3 times, and he's been on the show 21 years. It's a different
3
format. There's a lot more cast members, but it's still such a fantastic tribute to what he was able to do. If he had lived, he would have been a 5-timer in the early 2000s. He was already at 2 after being off the show only 4 years. And then, I mean, the work he did afterwards, yeah, he never got to be a movie star, but News Radio is still one of the funniest comedies of all time. And he was the centerpiece of that with doing his Bill McNeil. So sad that we lost him so early. And that certainly factors in, I think, to some of the voters. But still, great position for Phil.
Yeah, definitely. I would encourage all of our listeners, if you're ever going to listen to an episode of Fly on the Wall, go listen to the tribute they did a few months ago to Phil Hartman. I believe 25 years since his passing, and they spoke to a lot of people who were around at the same time as him. Jim Downey was a great one who spoke about Phil Hartman and mentioned how, with Phil, when they were producing the show, he was in so much of the show that it was like such a unique experience. Other cast members were trying to figure out the 1 or 2 or 3 things they were going to do in a night, but Phil was just ran the entire show. And again, like, I don't think there's been anybody like him since, or anybody like him before. There are derivatives of him, and other people have qualities of Phil Hartman, but every time somebody great comes around, we do compare him to the great Phil Hartman. So Haskell, I'd love to know any other thoughts you have, and then let's get into some of the moments from Phil's career that we would like to talk about.
Well, talking about the career that he was able to have for the short time after SNL, hopefully everybody this Christmas season was able to go watch Jingle All the Way. He's phenomenal. Like, if you have not seen him in that, make sure you check that out. Here's my thing. Everything you guys have said is correct. I don't want to take anything away from Phil Hartman. But in terms of him being number 1, I do have a very specific reason why I put him behind one guy, and a very specific reason why I put him behind another guy. And I'll get to that as we get to those 2 guys. But yeah, I think in terms of definitively putting him at number 1, there's a little something missing. And I'm going to wait on that because it's going to come up with the other guys. But yeah, he's still incredible. He's like, if you had to start an SNL cast with the number 3 all-time cast member in Phil Hartman, you're going to have a pretty good show.
Definitely. Bill, let's talk about some of your favorite moments from Phil during his time at the show.
Well, like I already mentioned with the Johnny O'Connor, that was pretty early on with Lovitz. He was over the hill movie actor, and Lovitz is trying to convince him that he can't act anymore. And what's the word on the street? I mean, that was something that was always in every clip show for a long time. Reagan Mastermind was also very early on. SNL had a really, really hard time getting a handle on Reagan 6 years into his presidency. I mean, part of that was cast turnover, but when they had Hartman for the last 2 of those years, he took it and just ran with it. And then, of course, Clinton, the McDonald's sketch with Clinton is still one of the all-time great sketches. So that's just a couple of the moments. But yeah, I encourage anyone to go back. Oh, and of course, Love is a Dream, which we've talked about extensively in a couple of the Superfan episodes with the equally wonderful Jan Hooks. A quieter moment with Phil, and still one of the standouts.
Yeah, a great Tom Schiller piece there to go back and check out if you haven't yet. Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer, absolutely love that character. That was voted as one of the greatest characters in SNL history when we did that countdown, and that one is so funny to me. When I saw the anal retentive chef for the first time on Saturday Night Live, I was like, I could relate to this, honestly. Like, I thought it was so funny to me, and just hit on these things. When he did Peter Graves, that impression for his Discover sketch, so great. There's just like a lot of really, really good understated moments that I think his Ed McMahon was fantastic as well. I love that impression that he did alongside Dana Carvey's Johnny Carson. I do think him and Jan Hooks, potentially one of the greatest duos in SNL history, just to see them play off each other. So there's a lot of really good moments there. Haskell, anything else on your list you want to talk about with Phil?
I still love the Wilson countersink phalanges. Like, that is just that tickles my funny bone. Like, that is one of those very specific sketches where if you don't get the joke right away, you're probably gonna be like, this sketch sucks. But it's really good. I love the specificness, and that's what Phil Hartman did so good. Is he might be, if he's not 1, he's number 2 as the most confident people I think that's ever been on SNL. And that's what he was able to do, like, really well. And that comes across there. Same thing with word exchange, which to me is like so much of what he brought to The Simpsons and Troy McClure and stuff like that. So I always loved that. And just going back through some of his sketches over the last couple of days to be prepared, I was watching Sassy Boys, and I thought that was way ahead of its time. I was thinking about like if he had done that with, you know, some other cast members later on in time, like I think that thing could have really shined. So those were just some of the moments I went back to.
Yeah, definitely. When he came back and hosted twice, he did this acting workshop sketch where he played a character called Bobby Coldsman, and to see him get to work with Will Ferrell was so exciting to me. Just to see them like that combo together again. Like I could only imagine what it would have been like to have Phil Hartman get to work with some other, you know, great cast members that would come ahead, but you know, chronologically. But seriously, just so many great moments here. I encourage anybody to go back and check it out. The truth is that when I first got into going back and watching old SNL, and I wasn't just watching stuff that was happening week to week, I had maybe heard of Phil Hartman. I knew he was somebody important, but I really didn't get it. And like, to me, it's like watching somebody from like an old era in a sport and being like, oh, okay, like this is why they got like a million MVPs. Like this is why they changed the game. I encourage really everybody to go back and check that out, like all of the footage that you can from Phil Hartman. So Rolling Stone, we've been doing this every week. Their list that they put out prior to SNL 40 had Phil Hartman as 7 on their list. Way too low. That's not good enough. So for me, here at 3, I'll show you where I have him on my list. Let's get final thoughts on the great Phil Hartman from Bill and Haskell. Bill, starting with you.
Yeah. I mean, really, everybody's said so much already. It's really amazing. He shaped my SNL fandom. I was a bigger fan of Dana when I was a kid because he had the funnier characters. But as I got a little bit older and was able to appreciate his subtle impressions, I mean, Donahue was another one too that he just took over. That's kind of faded into time because people don't know who Phil Donahue is. His Jimmy the Greek. He just had so many different roles that he was able to play. And he did it so well. And I can't think of Phil without thinking of Jan, who is my favorite all-time cast member, as is well known. And yeah, I mean, they were such an important part of my childhood, and being able to watch, as I told you, I'm back watching season 12, 13, 14 right now, and it still holds up. It's still funny, objectively funny. And a lot of that is because of Phil.
Haskell, final words on Phil Hartman.
I feel like we kind of just ranked Joe Montana 3rd on our all-time quarterbacks list, and some people might not be happy, but you know, I think he's one of those people that at a time was the greatest of all time. I'm just really jealous that I didn't get to, I wasn't around to watch him weekly. I feel like I would have really enjoyed that. I feel like he would have been one of those cast members that if you grew up and Bill kind of talks about it, and Bill experienced it, right? That I feel like he becomes one of those where you're like, that's one of our guys. Like, this is the comfort of watching this show and being a fan of the show year after year is somebody like Phil Hartman. So well-deserved being in the top 3.
All right. That closes the book on our talk about Phil Hartman for now. So we will get to the number 2 greatest cast member of all time. Let me put this to you both. Now that you know that Phil came in 3rd, who do you think is coming in 2nd? Bill, what do you think now?
I don't know if I can guess now because I'm completely shocked that one person is above him. So I'll stick with my original, thinking that it's going to be Will in number 1 and Bill in number 2 now.
Haskell, any changes? What do you think is coming up next?
Yeah, I think it's Bill Hader next.
Okay, let's get to it. Let's talk about the number 2 cast member as voted by you, the fans, in SNL history. What a cast member this was. So many great moments to talk about. Here we go. Number 2 on the list, which in turn will reveal who the number 1 cast member is as voted by you. We will get to number 1 when we do. Let's talk about this guy here at number 2, the one, the only, Will Ferrell here at number 2 as voted by the fans. 7 seasons on Saturday Night Live, 1995 to 2002. 136 episodes at the show, 27th all time, 772 episodes, 10th all time. I mean, Will Ferrell, to me, there's a lot of people, you know, someone we talked about last week, like Eddie, there's a lot of people who you can put into the category as somebody who saved the show. I believe that Will Ferrell is at the top of the list of people who saved Saturday Night Live. The work that he did on the show changed the game. There is a specific stat that people talk about in sports called wins above replacement, WAR. I think Will Ferrell has the greatest war in SNL history. Before he is on the show is suffering. When he leaves the show suffers. And there's no bigger impact, I think, that one person has on an individual episode or season than a guy like Will Ferrell, who dominates all aspects of the show. He is like a 5-tool player that you would describe in sports. He has every accolade you could put into an SNL cast member potentially. So, Haskell, what do you think? Will Ferrell here, number 2.
Listen, we know who number one's going to be, and number one might be my personal favorite, but we might have gotten it wrong. Will Ferrell is the greatest cast member in SNL history. He's the biggest star the show has ever made. Outside, Sandler and Eddie Murphy might be right there, but Will Ferrell's the biggest star the show ever made. On top of that, he's the biggest star the show ever had at the time. He was huge, and this is the difference between Will Ferrell and Phil Hartman for me. Okay, when we went through Phil Hartman's greatest sketches, greatest moments, there was some really funny sketches. But if I went to a group of people and I said, hey, Ronald Reagan impression or Bill Clinton goes here, whatever, right? People might remember it. If I walk into a group of 1,000 Americans and I start saying Celebrity Jeopardy, Cowbell, the cheerleaders, George W. Bush at the debates, it doesn't matter if you watched SNL ever, if you watched weekly, it doesn't matter. They know those sketches. Those are iconic moments in the show. When you list it up, there's a sports talk radio in Boston. There's a lot of talk about Hall of Fame talk for baseball and football. And one of the local, sports guys talks about, if I decide if somebody's in the Hall of Fame, I decide, can you tell the story of the MLB without this player? Can you tell the story of the NFL without this player? Not only can you, obviously you can't tell the story of SNL without Will Ferrell. He's in the top 3. If you don't tell the story of Will Ferrell, you miss some of the top 5 most iconic moments in the history of the show. And when you go back and you look at it, with no disrespect for Will Ferrell, I think had a very, very strong cast of female cast members around him, and he played off of some of them so well. I think in terms of the male cast members he had around him, it wasn't the strongest you've ever seen. It's not as strong as what number one had, and it's not as strong as what Phil Hartman had. He was a rock star. If you talked about, Phil Hartman was, the Chicago Bulls, or he was Babe Ruth, you're looking at Tom Brady right here. You're looking at the greatest of all time.
All right, Bill Kenny, let's get your thoughts on Will Ferrell. Those are some big statements from Andrew Haskell.
I'm glad Haskell went first on this because I needed a moment to compose myself and not throw my laptop across the room as I would during a Cowboys game. Listen, you mentioned it, John. The fact that he saved the show. Yes, he damn well saved the show. I can tell you, I was there watching the end of season 20, not knowing what the show was going to look like when it came back in season 21. And how terrible, unbelievably dreck-ridden the show was, despite the huge names that were on it at that point. And in the very first show, you get to see Will Ferrell say, "Get off the damn shed." And you knew it was going to be okay. That was it. That was like, okay, we're going to be all right. It may take a little time to get our footing. There's going to be some mistakes along the way. But Will Ferrell was the one who saved the damn show. We wouldn't be sitting here talking about who's going to come up at number 1 in a second, because there wouldn't be a Saturday Night Live. It was the only time in the history of the show that it didn't get a full season renewal. It could have been off the air by Christmas '95, and that would have been it. So beyond that, yes, everything that Haskell mentions, obviously Cowbell, I mean, one of the greatest sketches of all time, still something that you would go back and show somebody. All the Bill Brasky sketches, the Roxbury guys, and he elevated those lesser male cast members that Haskell alludes to. He made those sketches better, and the fact that he came back for one more season after 9/11 was so important to keep the show moving in the right direction at that point. We just needed something funny. And of course, his patriotic thong in the Sean William Scott episode is still an all-time banger. So yeah, Will Ferrell should be number one.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you described what it was like for you, Bill, growing up in real time, watching Will Ferrell come on and save the show. And for me, like growing up, I grew up with all of like the great Will Ferrell movies, right? So like he is one of the biggest movie stars in the world. And I had heard he was on Saturday Night Live, but like I didn't really grasp. I wasn't old enough to really get through that. And then when I got to it, it was like unlocking a vault of amazing content that I didn't know existed. And I was able to watch like episode after episode where he comes out and like, I think he has the greatest hit rate in SNL history. Like just bar none, like if you're measuring quality of sketch, I think that he has the most success ever on the show. And to me, like that is why he is so made for this show. And his analytics are pretty great as well. He has a 5.24 SPE. That's fifth all time in SNL history. He has hosted the show 5 times. So he is one of the cast members that is in the 5-timers club. His legacy has continued in that sense. So great to get to, continue to see him come back to the show as many times as he has. We mentioned some of the sketch leaders numbers from Phil Hartman, but Will Ferrell's are not too shabby either. I mean, 101 sketches in season 21. 100 in season 22, 131 sketches in season 23. So think about that. I mean, that again is not modern times, but like that's closer. And in 130 sketches, I mean, again, I don't think we're going to see anybody hit that mark. Kristen Wiig will come close to that. And I do think that there's an interesting comparison between a Kristen Wiig and a Will Ferrell who are, more active on the field than, let's say, somebody like Phil Hartman or the next person we're going to talk about in terms of their, dominance in any given episode and just being the A role, I guess is the word that I'm looking for, but really led the cast in most of the seasons that he's there. And I just want to, again, encourage you to, watch SNL right before, watch SNL right after. It is, nobody's left a bigger void on the show, I think, than when Will Ferrell leaves Saturday Night Live. And that is, part of his impact and legacy at the show. Every time he does come back, it is so exciting. Some other moments from the show that we have to talk about. I mean, the cheerleaders with Sherry O'Terry, that's like the first recurring sketch that we get from him. So great as well to get to see him work with all these different cast members. I think that's one of the great things about Will Ferrell is he worked with almost everybody on the cast. Like if you go through his recurring characters, he does the Roxbury guys with Chris Kattan. He has the cheerleaders with Sherry O'Terry. He does a bunch of stuff with Molly. Like he is so great with working with everybody around him. That is just one of the key qualities I think of Will Ferrell that you don't get with some of the other greats in the show is they're maybe more focused or paired off with certain players. I think Will really just works with everybody. So that's one of the things I love talking about with Will Ferrell. Haskell, what about you? Any other moments on the list that you would like to bring up from your favorite moments of Will Ferrell?
I think his impression of Harry Carey might be my favorite impression in the show history. It's such a great physical impression. It's such a great, it's a good impression, and it's a really good sort of character. It is just phenomenal to me. I could watch it over and over again. It makes me laugh. And then in terms of not really his time on the show, but coming back to host, Goodnight Saigon is one of my favorite sketches of all time. It's my favorite. It's one of my favorite endings to a season ever. It is such a great sketch, and it's such great sort of Will Ferrell humor. Those are the two that really stick out to me.
Yeah. I also love his morning latte sketches that he used to do. Those were like a really, really great morning show as well. The Lovers sketches that he did with Rachel Dratch, also fantastic stuff. Like his list is long in terms of a resume of stuff that he's done on Saturday Night Live. When he does come back and host the show, we never know what we're going to get from Will Ferrell because we never know what moments we might like. People are like, oh, give me Robert Goulet or something, even if he's not relevant anymore. Let's get that, because there's just such a laundry list of great moments from Will Ferrell. So to me, overall, like so well deserved to be in the top 3 here. I will have that debate with Haskell at the end of whether Will or Phil should be number 1, but we will get into it as we keep going on the show. Let's do some final thoughts on Will Ferrell. I will tell you that Rolling Stone on their list had Will Ferrell at number 12 back in the day. They said that Will Ferrell was a great team player, loved more cowbell, but no excuses not to have Will Ferrell, at least at the worst, in your top 5. All right, Bill Kenny, final words on Will Ferrell.
Rolling Stone is the worst. Can we just get that out of the way? Like,
I have to keep the bit going.
Goodness. Listen, everything you guys have said and more. I mean, Wake Up and Smile, one of the most berserk sketches that they've ever done. And I don't know that there's ever been a more quote. I mean, it's hard to objectify it, and you never know what other people are saying. But as far as my world, I don't think there's ever been a more quotable cast member on a Monday morning going to school or going like he had so many different sketches that you could go and quote. Still one of the few people I have the DVDs for because yeah, I don't ever want to not have that in my possession. And his Goulet, like you said, such a great thing. When he feeds that goat that walks up to the car, it's just one of those crazy moments. But yeah, I mean, the debates with George W. Bush, strategery is still something that's in the zeitgeist. You hear people saying it all the time, and they probably don't even know where they heard it from. It's amazing. So number 2 is not a bad place to be, but if you're going to quote Ricky Bobby from one of his movies, if you're not first, you're last, right? So little disappointing, but well done, Will Ferrell.
Yes, for sure. Definitely deserves to be up here, at least in one of the top 3 spots. Haskell, final thoughts on Will Ferrell?
Just somebody who shaped so many people's views of what SNL is and memories. I grew up in an SNL family, like my aunts, uncles, everybody watched it, but I still remember like my cousin being like 4 and like reciting. They had the best of Will Ferrell DVD, and they would like they go down the Cape. That's Cape Cod if you're not from Massachusetts. Go down the Cape, go camping and stuff, and they would bring the Will Ferrell DVD along and watch it over and over again. And it's just, like you said, the show, he saved the show, and he molded the show. And SNL is better, and SNL has a better legacy because they had Will Ferrell.
Absolutely. I also want to mention for anybody listening on audio who doesn't see the graphic on screen right now that Will Ferrell did have a similar resume in terms of sketch leadership to Phil Hartman, where he was the sketch leader in season 21, 22, 23. 24 was led by Daryl Hammond. It was a really big political season, so Daryl was doing a lot of impressions then. Also led in 25, tied with Parnell. And 26, and then season 27 as well. So really just as dominant as you could be on the show. And clearly once we're in this top 3, you get a lot of dominance at Saturday Night Live. All right, let's have this conversation. Let's do it. We've been waiting months for this. And according to all of you, all of the voters out there, we've tallied the results. Dim the lights. Here we go. Number 1 cast member in SNL history, according to you, the voters, is Bill Hader here at number 1. 8 seasons at Saturday Night Live, 2005 to 2013. 160 episodes at the show, 16th all time, 805 sketches, 9th all time. An absolute force during his time at the show. I do believe I see a lot of similarities here between a Phil Hartman and a Bill Hader, somebody who makes everybody around them better. And really, like in terms of prospects at the show, you see it in his first episode, how he comes out and just a man of a million voices could do so many things at the show. And I'll say during my initial watch, my live watch of the show, not knowing everything I knew about SNL history, I walked away from being like, wow, this guy is maybe the most talented person that has ever walked Studio 8H. And I could see why a lot of people felt like he was the greatest cast member in SNL history and why the votes went his way. Haskell, you were very excited about announcing Bill Hader as the number 1 cast member in SNL history. So let's get your thoughts here on our number 1 pick.
Yeah, like I said, listen, I thought Will Ferrell should be number 1, but Bill Hader's personally, like a lot of people who listen to this podcast, he's my favorite cast member of all time. Bill Hader's the reason that, you know, I do stand-up comedy. I had a little bit of success. I enjoy it. Bill Hader's a big reason as to why I do that, because Bill Hader's the guy that made me watch SNL and say, I want to make people laugh. I want to strive to be on that show. When you say like, oh, Bill Hader could do a lot of things, Bill Hader could do everything on SNL. He could do everything. The reason I think he's number 1, yeah, there might be some recency bias, but when you really say, hey, you're building somebody in a lab for SNL, it's Bill Hader. He did everything. But he was able to do everything. And this is, I don't mean to take points away from Will Ferrell, Phil Hartman for this reason, but the thing I just love about Bill Hader is while Will Ferrell and Phil Hartman, I think, are the 2 most confident performers SNL ever had, Bill Hader was just as talented as them, but he had this sort of like insecurity about him that made him a true not ready for primetime player. And I always loved that about him. My viewing experience of SNL was shaped by watching that era of the show, which was led by Bill Hader. He was not my vote for number one, but he is a very, very deserving number one.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a great point, Haskell, that we do have to factor in here, which is that Bill Hader has, blessed us with opening up into his mindset, throughout his time at Saturday Night Live, and talked about the type of anxiety that he had as a performer out there. He may not have had the comfort that some other people did close to the top, but when he got on stage and produced, I mean, he was like as a professional as a god and did some incredible work at his time at the show. So, Bill Kenny, let's get your thoughts on your namesake, Bill Hader.
Yeah, I mean, listen, he's not my number one, and he would be in my top 5 favorites of all time, which I think is very high praise. And there's a similarity with these 3 guys, which is really fascinating. The fact that they all came in right as the show was at its lowest points. And while Bill didn't save the show as much as maybe Phil or Will, he certainly was a big factor watching him debut, coming on, doing Pacino in the Katrina sketch. Was just a wow moment. And when you watch the show as long as we have, to get a wow moment at this point is pretty incredible. So many great impressions, maybe the best impressionist of all time. The most pure impressionist of all time. I love his work on the show. It's a bit high for where I would have had him, but still can't argue. He's one of those people that you can make a great argument for putting number one, and clearly a lot of people did.
Yeah, I think favorite of all time definitely factored in here when people were voting for sure. They're like, I love Bill. I cannot do that. And a lot of our social media following clearly is of a generation where they would love Bill Hader, and his work on Barry over the last few years boosts his legacy for sure at the show, because then it encourages people to go back and check out his SNL sketches, due to the fact that you get to see him stretch in a different way by being more dramatic in Barry versus what we got to see of him on Saturday Night Live. But I do think there is a huge difference between Phil Hartman, Will Ferrell, and Bill Hader. And that is that I think that Bill Hader, to Haskell's point, was not fully formed when he came onto the show. I think that Phil Hartman and Will Ferrell were so polished from when they got onto the show. They may have gotten better over time, but not to the extent that Bill Hader did. I think Bill Hader was, again, I watch a lot of sports, so I do compare this to baseball. I sort of reminds me of when like a September call up for baseball, where you have this like huge prospect that has like so much potential, but maybe like doesn't have all the tools yet to be able to pull it off on Saturday Night Live. And I think at the point where, before Amy Poehler like leaves the show and Maya Rudolph leaves the show in like season 33 and season 34, I think Bill Hader is just a part of the mix. Like, we have some really great sketches with Vinny Vedecci and really amazing impressions. And you're like, whoa, if this guy could put it all together, then I think he has it. Like, his career gets really interesting. And then I do believe from season 34, season 35, 36, 37, 38 is when he really turns it on and becomes this great cast member, where he starts to get, so season 34, he's second, season 35, he's first, season 36, he's second, season 37, second, and season 38, first in sketch appearances. And it's really him and Kristen Wiig that are really leading the show on a weekly basis. 4.86 sketches per episode. That's good for 9th all time. So he's really all over the show. And we get to see his voice take over the show in a way that you would have wanted for his entire career. And I just think he has, like I said, he's one of the greatest prospects in the show's history. Did he fully match everything he could do in the way that a Will Ferrell or Phil Hartman did? I'm not exactly sure, but that doesn't take away from the fact that I think that, as to Haskell's point, Bill Hader is one of my favorite cast members of all time, just because he is so freaking talented. So, Haskell, let's talk about some of our favorite moments from Bill Hader's time at the show.
Yeah, first thing is just not even a sketch, but just a story that I've heard told over time, that him and Andy Samberg auditioned on the same day, and he walked into the elevator with nothing, and Andy had a bag of props, and they both looked at each other and thought the opposite. Bill Hader said, "Oh my God, I didn't bring anything. He's got all these props. He's so prepared." And Andy Samberg, looked at Bill Hader and said, "He doesn't need any props or anything. He's that good." And I think that just speaks to both of them, but it also shows how well they bounced off of each other over the years together. He has one of the greatest send-offs of all time in SNL history. Stefan is, a top to me, a top 3 character in the show's history. And that send-off did something that we don't see a lot. And John, this is something that you mentioned a lot when we talk about potential things that SNL could have done. His send-off with Stefan and Seth's wedding really dove into the lore of SNL, and it took these stories and it took the history of Stefan, and it gave us a visual of it by bringing all these characters to life. That's something I wish the show would do a little bit more. Don't overdo it, but do a little bit more. So that's a great like all-time moment for him. Herb Welsh, for 90% of the SNL cast history, Herb Welsh would be their best character. I mean, it's in his top 5, but it's not there. And then just I've always loved the song Memories, and I know that's not a Bill Hader specific sketch, but those guys all working together and just some of the one-liners you would get from those sketches were fantastic. So those are some of the memories I remember.
Yeah, I totally agree. I believe that Stefan was voted as the best recurring character in SNL history by the fans, so it does make sense. That was a huge, huge deal. Like, I mean, the fact that people were just clamoring for Stefan to come back on the show week after week after week, and they kind of pulled that off. Like, they did the best they could in the style of what you got from Gilda Radner back in the day, where you get Emily Latella every week, or Rosanna Dana. Like, we started to get that in modern times with Bill Hader and Stefan. Every holiday, it's like, okay, we know that Stefan's going to pop up because he was that popular of a character. And I think with that character, you get those legacy points for a guy like Bill Hader. I say 2-time host. Definitely would love to see him host again. I don't know if he's sort of opposed to doing that at this point, but I think, if anybody needs to get into the 5-timers club at some point, like, we need more Bill Hader, especially at this next stage of his life and his career. Bill Kenny, what about you? Any other sketches from, your watch of Bill Hader's career that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, his Alan Alda, which is kind of a deep cut, a guy who hasn't been on TV in 30 years, but it is a spot on impression. And the Maryville Robots were fantastic. He was a big part of that. Keith Morrison, still one of the funniest things I've ever seen anywhere. His impression of the Dateline reporter is still top notch. Anthony Peter Coleman, The Puppet Show. He only did that a couple of times, and one of them was in his hosting gig, I believe, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and he was in the Californians, which has grown more and more funny to me as time has gone on. Listen, I mean, he's deserving of the spot. I think I had him a little lower and it's no fault of Bill's, because his cast was so stacked, and you can go back. Whereas if you look, even with the golden era of Phil and the silver era of Will, you're going to point to them 80% of the time as far as who do you remember. But with Jason and Andy and Kristen and Fred and Forte, I think it kind of splits the MVP vote for me, if you get my meaning, because I think that kind of takes away a little bit, but you're parsing minuscule points at this point. Still, you can't argue with them being number one. So very well deserved.
To that point, Bill, it sort of reminds me a little bit of our conversation of Phil Hartman and even Dan Aykroyd, which is like, when you go back to those 3 points in SNL history where we talk about golden eras, where the show was just, hitting its highest average as it did on a week-to-week basis, it is very hard to parse through who is making the show as great as it is, or who is the biggest contributor to those eras. And I think that if you were to stop and look at the show only a few years after those eras, it is really hard to see the forest from the trees. So you don't know whether it's Dana Carvey or Jan Hooks or Phil Hartman that is really the one that put it all together, or Dan Aykroyd or Belushi or Gilda, Bill Murray. Like, you start to just try and figure it out. And I think that is what happened with Bill Hader, where it was like, well, Andy Samberg did the digital shorts, and Bill and Kristen were really dominant. Will Forte had his part in all of that. Like, and you start looking, Seth was amazing. Like, just so many cast members. And I think that it's like, what we're getting with Bill Hader now is what we got with Dan Aykroyd and Phil Hartman over time, which is, now that it's been enough time since the era, people are going back and rewatching the seasons, and they're starting to realize on a rewatch, oh, wow, Bill Hader really made everyone around him better. And that is the quality that I think was passed down from Phil Hartman to Bill Hader, who I think are really similar cast members. And like, that is as high praise as I can get for somebody like Bill Hader. So for me, like, I don't know that it was as noticeable in the real time as it is now. or he was as appreciated in the real time as he was now, even if he was everybody's, favorite. So for me, that's why I think he got the number one spot here, just because over time, people are appreciating him more and more. So for me, I definitely think he deserves to be in this spot, very high up with the analytics, totally made for the show. We mentioned a lot of his characters. I'll say that one of my favorite characters he ever did on the show was Vince Blight, who was the host of What's That Name? The fact that he could play that evil host where he was like demented. I talked about that with Michael Longfellow a couple of weeks ago. That to me is a Phil Hartman-esque role that I love in the cast and is exemplary of what you look for in a glue guy and a sketch that makes everybody around them better. So that's one that I would encourage to go check out, even if it is not as popular as your Vinny Vedecci's or your Stefans or whatever else you're going to call it on there. Rolling Stone towards SNL 40. And again, caveat that he had just recently left the show, but they had him at 13, said that he is the most crucial utility player since Phil Hartman, and also mentioned Stefan, of course. All right, let's get final thoughts on number one here on the list, Bill Hader. Bill, over to you.
Yeah, you're right. Going back and watching more current stuff like Bill Hader would be interesting to see. I'm intrigued by your point there, and it may change what I think as far as how high he should be ranked. But yeah, fantastic career. One of the best post SNL careers with Barry and things like that. Hope he becomes a 5-timer. And yeah, I mean, just what more can you say about Bill Hader? Fantastic career.
Haskell, take us home with your thoughts on Bill Hader.
Yeah, so like I said, I feel Will Ferrell should be number one for everything he did at SNL. But if you gave me the chance, if you said you can start SNL from the beginning and you can pick anybody from history, Bill Hader's who I'm choosing. So to me, that kind of makes sense. It makes sense that he's at number one.
Okay, so that's our top three. We have revealed the entire list. What we're going to do next here is I'm going to bring up the list on the left. So we'll have our top 50 and we'll have my list on the right. So there's no more being fluid week to week. This is what I am locking in. So what I did this week, just so you all know, and again, I don't think I've had more stress with any activity in the entire history of podcasting than trying to put my list together here. But I'm really thankful for everybody who's encouraged me and let me know their thoughts. I've read all the comments about them. So I've thought about where I want to place everybody. I rejigged a few things, but I will present to you my top 50 next to the listeners' top 50, and we could talk through where I place these three cast members on the list and anything that these guys disagree with. I know that Bill Kenny also made a top 50 list as well, so we could talk about that, and then we'll get into some honorable mentions. We'll let you know who just missed the list this year. So here we go. On the left side will be the cast rankings. On the right side is my ranking. So from 50 all the way to 1, I have David Spade, Marty Short, Bowen Yang, Ego Wodem, Tracy Morgan, Chevy Chase, Tim Meadows, Mikey Day, Sherry O'Terry, and Adam Sandler. You may notice at the bottom, I did move Bowen back above Marty. I think a couple weeks ago with that cold open just solidified it for me. Like, I can't not do it. Sorry, Bill, but I had to put Marty back at 49. Tracy Morgan, I moved up just a touch. I just think legacy-wise, I was maybe discounting that a little bit. Tim Meadows, I moved down a touch there below Mikey and Sherry O'Terry. Sandler down a touch too behind Joe Piscopo. From 40 up, I got Piscopo, Jimmy Fallon, Seth Meyers, Taron Killam, Norm Macdonald, Vanessa Bayer, Chris Parnell, Rachel Dratch, Anna Gasteyer, and Kevin Nealon. I did move Anna Gasteyer up a little bit. I think I was maybe, forgetting about some of these great moments from Anna and her legacy at the show. So she's up to 32 on my list. Kevin Nealon, 31. And then up from 30, I got Bobby Moynihan, Beck Bennett, Aidy Bryant, Molly Shannon, Tina Fey, Andy Samberg, Maya Rudolph, Fred Armisen, Mike Myers. I did move down just a touch. I, was ready to sort of, think about the people in front of him. And I was like, I have to put them in front of him. I just can't do it, despite the fact that he's had such a successful career and has some really great characters and moments on the show. Will Forte, my favorite of all time, is at 21. And then my top 20 starts with Jane Curtin, John Lovitz, Daryl Hammond, Chris Farley, Cecily Strong, Jason Sudeikis, John Belushi, Jan Hooks, Bill Murray, and Dan Aykroyd just falls out of my top 10 at number 11. All right, here's my top 10 cast members of all time. Gilda Radner, number 10. Amy Poehler, number 9. I moved her down just a little bit. I listened to a lot of stuff on this. I am a huge Amy Poehler fan. I think she's totally underrated on people's lists, but I settled on her at number 9. I moved up Eddie Murphy to number 8. He really had such a strong legacy of the show, impactful. I think the fact that he did come back and host in 45 will lead him into number 8 on my list. Otherwise, I may have put him as touch lower, but I have Eddie there and we could talk about that. Kate McKinnon with her great hosting stint last week, number 7. Kenan Thompson, number 6. Dana Carvey just outside my Mount Rushmore at 5. I put Bill Hader at 4. That's where I think is the right spot for him, honestly. Kristen Wiig and Will Ferrell. Kristen Wiig, number 3. Will Ferrell, number 2. To me, 2 of the most dominant cast members in SNL history at 3 and number 2. And Phil Hartman is my number 1 cast member of all time. The analytics just show it. I just think if you had to pick one person to start an SNL cast with, I'm starting it with Phil Hartman. So my Mount Rushmore, my top 4, 1 Phil Hartman, 2 Will Ferrell, 3 Kristen Wiig, and 4 Bill Hader. All right, Bill Kenny, what do you think? How did my list turn out?
Excusing the Martin Short hate for the 18th straight week. No, listen, this is great. I think your list looks great. Have a lot of similarities here. I think Eddie is a tad low, in my opinion, just because of everything that's been talked about with what he was able to do with the show. But again, you're really down to it when you're in the top 10 of a 50-year-old show with this much talent. So pretty good. Do you want me to run down my top 10 or is
I definitely do. I would like to say that for when it comes to Eddie Murphy, so I definitely got a lot of comments last week about, where I placed Eddie on my list. It was a little bit lower. It was behind Amy, Gilda, and Dan Aykroyd. And ultimately I did feel like I needed to find a way to get Eddie in my top 10 for sure. I think his legacy is so important. What he did on the show was so great. I may have discounted some of the stuff he did like as part of an ensemble because it really was. I sort of compared the Eddie Murphy show a little bit to the Chevy Chase show, and maybe that wasn't so fair to Eddie. But I do think that, again, part of this a little bit is the longevity factor, which is, more important to me than it is to Bill. And we've had this discussion off the podcast where I just think that like Eddie Murphy leaves the show of his own volition. Like season 8 of the show, I think is a really great season of the show. He leaves and pre-records sketches and then he leaves. And then after he hosts in season 10, we don't see him for 35 years at the show. And if I'm just looking like my list does factor in overall contribution to the series of Saturday Night Live. No doubt Eddie did save the show at one point. That is why he is in the top 8 cast members in SNL history for me. But some of the people above him, I think, had an overall greater contribution to the history of the show. And that's why I ultimately led him to 8 there.
That's fair.
All right, Bill, let's hear your top 10.
Okay, so at number 10, I have Bill Hader. Kate McKinnon at 9, Kenan at 8, Jan Hooks at 7, Eddie at 6, Kristen at 5, Gilda at 4, Dan Aykroyd at 3, Will Ferrell at 2, and Phil Hartman at number 1. So we have the same 1-2 punch.
Yeah, that makes sense there. All right, Haskell, what do you think about my list, Bill's list, and everything that came together tonight?
You got 2 lists on the screen, and then we listed a third top 10. And at no point did we get number 1 correct. It's Will Ferrell. It's Will Ferrell. He is the home run hitter. You know what I mean? He's the all-time home run king in my book. I respect analytics and I respect the dominance, analytically of Phil Hartman, but I also believe in sports. Story time for you. Analytics, Moneyball will tell you you don't steal bases in baseball. Okay. I watched when I was 9 years old, I watched the Boston Red Sox break the 86-year-old curse of the Bambino. And you know what the biggest play in that playoff series was? Stealing second base. Because sometimes you have to throw the analytics out and you just have to feel it. And when you think of Will Ferrell, he's number 1. He's the home run hitter. He's the greatest to ever do it on the show. Besides that, John, on your list, I really am happy to see Kenan get his, you bring him up a little bit on that list. He's so integral to literally like half of the run. You talk about a show that's been on for 50 years and Kenan's pushing half the runtime of the show is incredible to think about. So I'm glad that he's up there for you. I would not put Kristen Wiig over Bill Hader. everything I said about Bill Hader still stands. I still love Kristen Wiig. She made me love the show just as much. I think, it might sound, I know Bill Hader had a lot of characters that he went back to. I think Kristen Wiig went back to a certain archetype a little bit too much for me to put her in my top 3.
Well, can I just say something just to jump in quickly on just a couple of your points, which is like, I think that the Will Ferrell and Kristen Wiig, to me, like I said, I compare those two so much because I think in terms of like hit rate and dominance on the show, like you watch a Will Ferrell episode from his era or a Kristen Wiig episode from her era, and they are very much taking over the show. Whereas people like Phil Hartman and Bill Hader, the other two in my top 4, are more understated. Like the impact, again, is not so easy to see. If you are watching SNL on beginner mode, you don't notice all the amazing things that Bill Hader and Phil Hartman do as much as you will a Will Ferrell and Kristen Wiig. So to me, the order here, yes, like 3, 4, like they're very, very close to each other. But to answer your question of why Phil over Will, I don't think it's just an analytics argument here. I also think that like overall, the impact of Phil Hartman on that era to me is just as strong as Will Ferrell's was to his. I know that like the cast around Phil Hartman was greater than the cast around Will Ferrell, but I just think that if you took Phil Hartman and you put him in Will Ferrell's era and you swapped their spots in SNL history, which again is a complete hypothetical, but I can see that you would like they would be just as good as each other. Like I think that Phil Hartman did what the show needed him to do. Like they didn't need him to be Will Ferrell, but with the show needed Will to be Will, and that I think is the difference here.
I think we made the same point. I think we value it differently.
Yes, exactly.
Like, you know what I mean? Like you look at it and you go like, they didn't need him to do that. I look and be like, they didn't need him to do it. And Will Ferrell, like, because they needed Will Ferrell to be Will Ferrell, he came away with some of the most important sketches of all time. And that's why he's number 1 for me.
Yes. But then just to ask you a follow-up question, in that case, your argument of like, they needed Will to be Will and that helped him be so great. You probably would make the same argument for an Eddie Murphy, right? Because they needed Eddie to be Eddie when Eddie was on the show. And that would probably make you put Eddie above me. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think to me still Eddie Murphy. I think everything you said about longevity stands, and that's why I would really struggle to put him in the top 3. I would still, yes, he's top 8. I still like putting him in that like 4 spot where he is. I could definitely have Kristen Wiig jump him though, so I would put him maybe at 5.
Yeah, and I also just want to make one more point, which about Kristen Wiig versus Bill Hader here, which is that again, like I think they're so close to each other. For me, like again, this show, Gilda Radner, Jane Curtin, and Lorraine Newman are so talented and fantastic. Jan Hooks, JLD, like there's been a lot of great women who have been on the show for previous generations. Obviously, we talked throughout the weeks and weeks about how, Molly and Anna and like they changed the game a little bit. And then we get to the Tina and Amy and all that stuff. But to me, like no woman has ever dominated the show, save for maybe Amy Poehler times, than Kristen Wiig. And Kristen Wiig, to me, like to do that in a show that was largely known for being like a white man driven comedy show, to me, like I don't want to understate that point. So like that is also to me a legacy factor for Kristen Wiig in terms of like her domination as a woman in the show. Like she was in a cast with Bill Hader and Andy Samberg and Will Forte and Fred Armisen, and she dominated episode after episode with all of these all-time great legends of the show. So I just think that like that is probably the reason why I have to consider having her in my top 3.
And just one point to Kristen Wiig, I think if you look at like her farewell just shows how much Lorne in the entire show really viewed her. I think if you could inject Lorne Michaels with the truth serum and really get an honest answer out of him, I think just watching the show, watching the way Kristen Wiig has been handled, I think he might tell you that she's his favorite cast member of all time.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Bill, any last comments on these lists, or should we get to some honorable mentions?
Yeah, the only other thing I'll say, both of your points about Kristen are fantastic. And when I write my book about the women of SNL, that's going to be a major point. Like you have to walk before you can run, and seeing, where they started with Gilda and Jane and Lorraine, and then getting to the dominance of Jan Hooks and all the way through. Like if somebody just started watching the show in the last 5 years and they're like, wow, the SNL is an equal opportunity employer. Look at how much Cecily and Adie and Kate dominate the show. And to explain to somebody younger, like that wasn't always that way. And Kristen was the first crack in that ceiling, really, that made a difference and showed, okay, a woman can dominate the show over all these men, and God bless her for it.
Absolutely. All right. So that is my top 50 list. As always, I encourage you to let me know what you think of my list here as well. I will tell you that my bottom 4 on my list, Ego and Bowen and Marty and David Spade. And I'll say for Ego and Bowen, who are still on the show and have opportunities to show me why they definitely should be higher up on my list. They have the legacy still to build here. But my bottom 4, I would probably replace with 4 others that I was thinking about before we started this list. And when we put together the top 50, I'll tell you who they are, because what I'm going to do on screen is I'm going to bring up a graphic of 11 other cast members, and we're doing 11 because there was a tie here to get into the top 60 of all time. So I'm going to bring up the next 11 cast members that were voted on by the listeners, and we'll talk through if any of them should have made it on to the top 50 list, and then we'll get some honorable mentions that were on Bill's list as well that didn't make the show. So here we go. In no particular order, I'll tell you who the next 11 cast members were that voted by the listeners. So we have Michael Che, Heidi Gardner, Leslie Jones, Colin Jost, Chris Kattan, Tim Kazurinsky, Dennis Miller, Kyle Mooney, Lorraine Newman, Jay Farrow, and Chris Rock were the next 11 cast members that came very close to making it to the list here. So, Bill, were any of these honorable mentions on your top 50 list?
Yes. A lot of them. Che and Jost were both in my top 50. Heidi was in my top 30. Lorraine and Dennis Miller, the criminality of what's happened. And part of that is because he kind of went to the dark side, and you cannot overstate what a big name he was in the 90s. After he left the show, he was hosting the ESPYs and the VMAs. He had his own talk show on HBO for 10 years, which was very informative. I feel like he's been lost in the shuffle over the time. But yeah, Dennis Miller definitely should have been in the top 50. I know some people took off points for Weekend Update anchors. He was in a lot of sketches. He didn't anchor any, but he was in a lot of sketches. So it wasn't like he was just at the desk like Che and Joe started today.
Haskell, do you think that any of these people should have made the top 50 list?
Yeah, I agree with everything Bill said about Dennis Miller. I think he kind of, we talk about people who saved the show. Obviously, he didn't save the show. I think he kind of saved Weekend Update, though. He turned Weekend Update into the parody of the news and more into this, like, why I think Weekend Update is so popular, in that it's kind of the Late Show monologues is what it is. It's punchy one-liners about topical news, and I think he did a big part in revitalizing that. If he didn't come along when he did, I do think there is a chance that they eventually just cut Weekend Update from the show. Like, it went a long time without being really that relevant or even that good. So I do think he deserves a spot on the show, on the list. Not getting Lorraine Newman as an original cast member on the show kind of stinks a little bit. I was kind of surprised, to keep 50 people in your brain at all times. We had kind of pre-show made a joke about Chris Kattan, and it kind of a light bulb went off in my head thinking, like, Chris Kattan didn't make it in, huh? Kyle Mooney's obviously a personal favorite. I'm not too broken up that he didn't get in. And then Jost and Che, I would put on the list with the asterisks if they went in together. And I think that's the only time I would do that. There's no other duo in the history of the show where I would be okay with them going in as one. But if you put them together, I think they break the top 50. Alone, I don't know if they do.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think I have Jost. Yeah, go ahead, Haskell.
Oh, and sorry. And TJ was just wondering who the hell that guy in the middle of the screen was.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, Jost and Che, I think we're definitely inside my top 50. At this point, again, I mean, that joke swap that they had last week was just like, I mean, if you're ever gonna put up a film to send to the Academy where you consider putting them in your top 50, you have to think about it when you have Jost and Che last week doing that joke swap. Chris Kattan is somebody who is fully into my top 50 for sure. I think totally underrated and forgotten about. I like I can't imagine not having him in there. Like would be lower on the top 50 list, but to me, he's like the number one of these honorable mentions that I think I would put in there. Dennis Miller, I think I would also consider putting in there. He's the anchor that I'm never really sure how to feel about him. When I watched him going through, I'm like, this guy's amazing. And then like Norm Macdonald came around and I was like, oh, okay. Like I get it, like, but and I also think like Dennis, besides the fact of, some of his off screen stuff, I also think the fact that he hasn't come back to the show really like ever, I think does hurt him a little bit legacy wise, whereas all the other anchors ahead of him do have probably more of like a long-term impact on the show. So yeah, that's a factor here. I think another couple names on this list that I would have considered for mine that didn't make it even into let's say the top 60. Nora Dunn, I think, is somebody that for sure like I have to think about there. So she's somebody that I was thinking about. Garrett Morris, again, like sign of the times a little bit, but I do think like definitely deserves some recognition. So for me, I would say those are a couple that I consider. Bill, anybody else on your list that you had?
Yeah, Garrett was the one missing from this. And also, I know you'll wholly disagree with this because of your Martin Short take, but Billy Crystal, I think, even though he was only on for that one season, he had a big impact on the show for that 1 year, maybe more so than Martin. So I think I would have snuck him into the top 50 as well.
Yeah, I do agree with that, actually. I don't disagree at all. I think that if I had to pick somebody from season 10 of the show, I am picking Billy Crystal over Martin Short, even though I think Marty has a long-term legacy impact on the show. Like Billy Crystal, we get him in a weekend update spot with Vanessa Bayer at some points, but like besides the fact that Billy Crystal was on season 1 of the show, also as well as Bill Crystal, we don't get Marty. We get Marty much more on the show afterwards and has more of a long-term impact. So I could see why he was the one from that season that got through, but Billy really is the star of that season and totally would be up for consideration here. All right, gentlemen, that does it. That is our top 50 greatest cast members in SNL history countdown. Once, like I said, I really want to thank everybody for voting for this list. It's been such a thrill and an honor to get to go through them week after week. If you were watching this and you were like, oh, I don't agree, well, you should have voted because we put out the voting. We let people vote for a few days and then we tallied up the results. And we're definitely going to do something like this again next year. Not the greatest cast countdown. We'll probably save that again for another 10 years, maybe if we're still around. But we'll do another countdown at some point, and we really encourage you to vote because then you have stakes in the game as you're watching these get revealed week by week. So I really enjoyed this, and so thrilled that I got to do this with so many great voices week after week. So Bill, Kenny, thank you for joining us tonight.
John, thank you for having me. This has been a wild ride. Can't wait to start the bottom 50 of SNL cast members next week with you. No, we're not doing that. Okay. No, yeah, this has been a lot of fun discourse, and to understand how many people, especially fans of the podcast, really understand the history of the show is very heartwarming to see over and over again. So you can follow me at BKLove73.
Haskell, thank you for joining us tonight. Great takes. Always happy to have you on. So tell the listeners where they can check you out.
It's so incredible. Thank you for having me on this countdown. The only thing I can think of, it would be incredible if we did a full, like a draft of all the cast members and somebody got 2 top 4 cast members of all time, even though he was put at the end of the first round. That'd be incredible if somebody pulled that off. That'd be an all-timer move. I don't know if it's ever happened. We'll have to go back and check the record book. But check me out, Andrew E. Haskell, and January 7th and 21st. Come on down to Rhode Island Comedy Connection. Watch me do my thing. Help me get on SNL. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. You can go back and check out the draft that Haskell is referring to from the summer of 2021. So if you want to go check that out, that was a lot of fun here in the SNN archives. Okay, so up next at the show, we're going to take a little bit of a break. It's the holidays, so I hope you check out our backlog of content in the meantime. But we will be back in 6 days from now, next Wednesday night, December 27th, for a very fun draft where we will be drafting one-time hosts in the history of the show that are still alive who we would like to see host the show again. So we got 8 panelists together to draft these hosts. 5 rounds, 40 hosts went. It was really exciting, and we're going to air that next Wednesday night for you all, so you can check that out. The following week of New Year's, we'll do some best of content, and then we will be back with our next live show on Monday, January 8th, I'll be back with Mike Murray. We will do our mid-season SNL by the numbers show, where we will recap the first half of the year, go through each cast member and talk about their analytics so far, as we look ahead to Jacob Elordi and Renee Rapp doing headlining the show on January 20th. So we're going to get there inch by inch, less than a month away from the next episode of SNL. Really want to thank everybody for joining us week after week on these countdown shows. It was you that kept me going. So excited to get to keep doing this during the SNL season, because everybody kept joining us week after week in the chat. So appreciate all of you and everybody who commented after the fact. You can follow us on social media at the SNL Network to see everything we got going on, and subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcast, and Spotify. Want to wish a very Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to everybody who listens to the show, and to you and all your families. I just hope you have a wonderful, wonderful time, whatever you're doing. So on behalf of Haskell, Bill Kenny, and myself, John Schneider from the SNN, we will see you next time, everybody. Have a good